everyone. I'm Ebony Bennett. I'm Deputy Director at the Australia Institute, and welcome to our Economics of a Pandemic webinar series. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which I live and work here in Canberra. It's Ngunnawal country here, and a beautiful day, I must say, despite being a bit cold. And I'd like to acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded, and pay my respects to elders past and present, and to welcome any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islanders who are joining us on this webinar today. During the pandemic, the Australia Institute is aiming to do these webinars at least weekly, but the days and times do vary. So make sure that you're subscribed or register by checking out our website at tai.org.au/webinars so you don't miss out. And just a few tips before we begin to help this webinar run smoothly. If you hover over the bottom of your screen, you should be able to see a Q&A function where you can ask questions of our panelists, and you should be able to upvote questions and make comments on other people's questions as well. Please keep things civil in the chat. And just a reminder that this discussion is being recorded, and we'll post it on our website after the webinar, and we'll also email it to everyone who's registered for today's event. We had close to 1,000 people register today, and thank you all for coming along. So a few weeks ago, we spoke with former Prime Minister and Chair of Beyond Blue, Julia Gillard, about mental health during the pandemic. And we really looked at the big picture on mental health, covering things like the consequences of isolation and complications about working from home. And we had such a huge response to that webinar that we wanted to explore some other aspects to mental health in Australia in some more detail, including depression, but also anxiety, addiction, and the effects of trauma. So we are talking today to Mind Medicine Australia, a charity that enables the development of regulatory approved and research-backed psychedelic assisted psychotherapy for the treatment of mental ill health in Australia, and to Fearless, a charity that works with people living with the consequences of post-traumatic stress, often referred to as PTSD. Fearless also helps family members in any way affected by post-traumatic stress, and their work complements the activities of other community-based organisations and government agencies that help with post-traumatic stress. So today I'm delighted to introduce our four guests. We've got Andrew Robb, who until his retirement recently from politics was the Minister for Trade, Investment and Tourism in the Turnbull government. And in this role, Mr. Robb negotiated free trade agreements with South Korea, Japan and China, as well as the 12-country Trans-Pacific Partnership Free Trade Agreement, the Comprehensive Strategic Partnership with Singapore, and he's currently the Executive Chairman of the Robb Group. He's a board member of the Kidman Cattle Enterprise, chair of AsiaLink and I can't pronounce that, genetics company, I'm sorry, Andrew, CNS Does, and a strategic advisor to Sea Farms Limited, as well as a range of national and international businesses. But today he's joining us in his capacity as a director at Mind Medicine Australia. Simone Reed is a board member at Fearless. Simone Reed's drive to motivate and inspire penetrates every aspect of her life. She's got a 24-year military career. She's also a mountaineer, a teacher, and owner of Summit Fitness Studio. She's a founding member of the not-for-profit Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder Australia and New Zealand charity Fearless. She's also a mother of three, one with special needs, and she's no stranger to the cause and effect of PTSD on individuals, families, and organisations. And I might let Simone tell you a little bit more about that later. Tanya de Jong is Executive Director and co-founder of Mind Medicine Australia. She's one of Australia's most successful female entrepreneurs and innovators, developing 5 businesses and 3 charities, including Creative Universe, With One Voice, The Song Room, and of course, Mind Medicine Australia. And she works across public, private, creative and community sectors and is passionate about mental health, innovation, diversity and inclusion. And Dr. Prash Pushpanathan, I hope I've pronounced that correctly, is an advisory board member of Mind Medicine Australia. Mostly known as Dr. Prash P, he has been a medical doctor at the Alfred Hospital, where he recently held the position of neuropsychiatry fellow. He entered the field of psychiatry so as to further his interest in the therapeutic potential of psychedelics. He's been an advocate on the importance of these medicine-assisted psychotherapies to the medical community, both in Australia and globally at various conferences. And he was voted Young Executive of the Year by the Australia-wide India Executive Council in 2018. Before we get to our distinguished guests today, I'd like to start by playing you a video, and I'm hoping that this will work. Forgive me if we have difficulties with the technology. But again, welcome to everyone who's joining us today. I can see about 350 of you in here, and we welcome you all. So here we go. And now I can't find this file. Worked twice when I double checked it, and now of course it's not working, so I'll come out of that, and I might hand over to you first, Tanya, while I try and make this video work. Tell us about Mind Medicine Australia.
Yeah, so look, ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure and honour to be here, and we'd like to thank the Australia Institute for their foresight in running these webinars on a range of important topics. We're in the middle of a global epidemic of depression, trauma, loneliness and social isolation, exacerbated by the pandemic, accelerating technology and climate change, and increasing fear, uncertainty and change. Our lack of connection to ourselves and others is causing increasing depression, addictions and other mental illnesses. For far too long, the treatment of mental illness has been the poor cousin of physical illness. This is highlighted by the fact that there has been minimal scalable innovation in treatments for mental illness for 5 decades. The science behind many of the pharmaceuticals used is 50 years old, and the remission rates for common mental illnesses like depression, PTSD and addiction are between 20 and 35%. According to the Productivity Commission and Black Dog, 1 in 5 of us had a mental health condition pre-COVID. 1 in 2 of us is estimated to experience a serious mental illness in our lifetimes. 1 in 8 of us were on antidepressants, including 1 in 4 older people and children as young as 5, being given psychiatric drugs, along with their nasty side effects. This, of course, is being massively exacerbated by the crisis. We're seeing increasing suicides and a 33% increase in self-harm in Victoria in the past 6 weeks alone. This is tragic, and these statistics cannot do justice to the heartache, suffering and community damage that mental illness is currently having on our society. Australia's mental health system is being crippled by accelerating levels of mental illness in the absence of effective treatment options. Whenever we hear about changing or improving the sector, it's all about more resources, better patient access gateways, and improved efficiencies. The point I want to make is that all of these things are important, but they won't fundamentally change the mental health statistics, which are getting worse by the day. Because the elephant in the room is that we don't have the treatments today that will heal the majority of patients who are in the system. Talking about positive responses to treatments is a cop-out, because we need to be focused on getting people well and out of the system. Mental illness shouldn't have to be a life sentence. What we're speaking about today are psychedelic assisted therapies, where you combine just 2 to 3 doses of either psilocybin, which is the psychoactive component of magic mushrooms, or pure MDMA with psychotherapy. In 120 recent trials at universities, including Harvard, Oxford, Yale Imperial College, the remission rates have been up to 80%, meaning the patient no longer qualifies for the diagnosis. The FDA has granted these therapies breakthrough status in the USA because the research demonstrates they can change the mental health treatment paradigm and dramatically improve remission rates. This breakthrough therapy status is only granted to medicines which are considered vastly superior to existing treatments. Furthermore, a devastating amount of veterans and first responders suffer lifelong with PTSD and other mental illnesses and substance abuse if they don't commit suicide first. The normal remission rates for PTSD with current treatments are just 20%. Yet in clinical trials, with 107 patients suffering PTSD for an average of 18 years, closely monitored by the FDA in the US, it was found that 67% no longer had PTSD after 12 months, following just 3 doses of pure MDMA combined with therapy. And these medicines are now also being trialled for obsessive compulsive disorder, eating disorders like anorexia, dementia, and a range of addictions. This is literally the first scalable treatment in 50 years, and Australia is way behind North America and Europe in the development of these therapies. And this is why my husband, Peter Hunt, and I started Mind Medicine Australia nearly 2 years ago as a registered charity to ensure that these therapies could be accessed by medical practitioners and their patients, irrespective of their location or financial circumstances, as part of the medical system as soon as possible. Just imagine this. A mental health system with more treatment options that provides real hope. A mental health system that's no longer defensive, but is starting to dramatically improve the mental health stats, meaning that millions of people are getting well and leading meaningful lives. We have to focus on the science and get over the stigma that is associated with these substances due to President Nixon's politics in the 1970s, because these substances will only be used as medicines in medically controlled environments and never be taken home by patients. All the data shows they're safe and non-addictive, and indeed they're being used to treat addictions very effectively. Some doctors describe these as antibiotics for the mind. I like to think of them as resetting or rebooting our brains, cleaning up and defragging our faulty discs, helping us to break out of our rigid and stuck thought patterns by rewiring our neural pathways. Thus, we finally feel connected to ourselves, others, and our planet, part of everything. It's from that place of connection that we can become agents for our own healing, and that is why these medicines are so effective. Brigadier General Sutton, New York City's Commissioner of Veterans Services, said, "If this is something that could really save lives, we need to run and not walk toward it. We need to follow the data. We need our politicians and regulators, our medical practitioners, and all of you to be proactive, to give all Australians who live with multiple failed attempts at recovery the opportunity to access treatments that will improve and save lives." This is personal for every single one of us. Every day, we hear of the devastating suffering and suicides, and we can't afford to wait any longer. And I just want to thank you all.
Thanks, Tanya. Andrew Robb, we'll come to you next. Most people will probably be familiar with you as a coalition minister, someone in the parliament, attending and negotiating trade deals. You're not necessarily, if you'll forgive me for saying, the first person that people might think of or who immediately springs to mind as an advocate for this type of clinical use of psychedelics. Can you tell us about your own experiences with depression and how you came to be at Mind Medicine?
Thanks very much, Ebony, and thank you everybody who's participating in this webinar this morning. I'm really grateful for your interest. My lived experience with depression, it goes back many decades. For 43 years, every morning I'd wake up from the age of 12 or 13, for 43 years, every morning I'd wake up with no confidence, a sense of no confidence, a sense of pessimism. You know, I'd avoid decisions, never watch morning television, couldn't stand the radio on, and that was my life for 43 years, notwithstanding the fact that I'd go to sleep taking on the world. After 2 or 3 hours in the morning, for many of those years, this funk would lift off me and I'd turn into an A-type person. Since 28, I've been CEO of organisations all that time, so lots of pressure, etc. But I couldn't handle it in the morning, so I had to have strategies where I would avoid any contact, much communication, and I did all sorts of crazy things trying to find endorphins because I was in denial about what it was when I was younger, and for much of my life, the stigma associated with depression has been huge. Fortunately, it's starting to move, and it's one of the reasons I'm getting involved, if nothing else, but to share my experience, encourage people to, in their own world, to try and find some help, whatever it might be. Over the years, that little black dog that visited me every morning got later and later before it lifted. And it got to a point in my 50s where, and I had lots of responsibilities, as you were mentioning. I had to go and get help. I had to do that properly, I had to admit that I had a problem with depression, and I had to go and find an answer. For me, fortunately, I was one of the 35% after 6 months of trial and error, because the science is so inexact in this area, so little. But after 6 months of trial and error, I found a medication which worked for me. And through all those years with the trade agreements and all the rest, it did work for me. And for the 9.5 years, it was probably the best time of my life since I was a kid. But unfortunately, this is the nature of a lot of the medications. Either it doesn't work for 70% of the population, or when it does work, as it did for me, 6 months ago, it stopped working. And they've got no idea why it stops working. It's such a hit and miss situation, and then only some like myself are really able to benefit from it for any length of time. I'm still in the middle of trial and error and trying to tackle it. Now, on this journey, which I've had, and many hundreds of thousands would have versions of it, I've got no doubt, I came across psychedelics only 6 or 8 months ago, probably a bit earlier, sorry. But, you know, I was introduced to Tanya and Peter, but also they taught me to go and have a read of some of the literature. And I just mentioned one by Michael Pollan, Pollan, How to Change Your Mind. It captures the history of psychedelics. They go back centuries in a lot of the South American countries, and that they were used for medicinal purposes for forever, not recreational so much as medicinal. And I started to look at the outcomes, and I've always been interested in the outcomes, less the theory. And the outcomes, as Tanya has mentioned, the clinical trials that started again in recent years are producing spectacular results. It was in the 50s and 60s seen as the new frontier for mental health, but for political reasons, as Tanya mentioned, in the 60s they were banned by President Nixon. The rest of the world thought, well, we better ban it too. It was banned mainly because of the impact of recreational use, and the medicinal purposes were overlooked. I must say, in conclusion, I feel really cheated. There's 50 years since the 50s and 60s, when I was a kid, where this could have been another option that was available to professionals, another option to see if it suited. The spectacular results, as Tanya mentioned, are such that remission can be expected, not just a state of alleviating some of the side effects of these pills. After 9.5 years, they work well for me, but you've got lots of side effects. With the psychedelics, if it works for you, and it's working for 80% in some cases, if it works for you, you've got no addictive capacity, you've got no pill to take every day, you've got no side effects. It is an option which must be, but the regulations and the law must be changed to allow professional therapists to conduct this and provide another option in the suite of options that are available for people with mental health problems. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Andrew, for sharing that. I'm sure everyone on the line here can just understand how exhausting that sounds, a constant battle, and as you said, only alleviation, not necessarily a relief of everything at hand. Dr. Prash, we'll come to you next. You're really looking at the clinical side of things. Can you explain to us a little bit more about your work and what things look like in the clinical context?
Thanks, Ebony. The pandemic has really created new deficiencies as much as it has exposed perhaps our current vulnerabilities to their true extent. And mental health is undeniably one such. And for the vast majority of high prevalence disorders, as we call them in psychiatry, that's anxiety, depression, the effects of trauma, addiction, there really are only two modes of treatment. You have medication, principally antidepressants, which, as Andrew has spoken to, work for some time for some more, and then don't work at all for a few. My personal view on antidepressants is that they are like training wheels on a bike. They'll keep you from falling, but if you don't learn to ride the bike in that time and you take them off, you're going to fall. The alternative then is to learn to ride the bike. Therapy, of which there are many schools of, they vary in modality and targets and duration. To me, that is where healing really begins, because you're actively working to change habits, behaviors, ingrained cognitive loops. But here's the thing, it requires work and time, months, sometimes years, to undo what has been done over a lifetime. And when it requires time, that costs money. Therapy isn't cheap, neither should it be. But that, along with the fact that it's mentally and emotionally exhausting, means that it's often too daunting for many. And so we have psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy, which, depending on which psychedelic you're talking about and how deep you want to go into esoteric language, can be described as creating a portal into the subconscious, or exposing one to the lessons of higher powers via mystical experiences, or more simply, allowing one an understanding of the self and the world that normally would require years of analysis to reach. It's almost surgical in its operation. As Tanya mentioned, sometimes a single session, sometimes 2 to 3 sessions, producing remission rates that dwarf anything we see in conventional treatments, and which are sustained, most importantly, 6 months, 12 months. More recently, we've had 24-month follow-up trials. Psychedelics, when used properly, by which I mean well-prepared and intentioned mindset, and in a very carefully curated and guided setting, have a way of stripping away that defensive shield that we carry with us everywhere, called the ego, and sort of laying out soft, mushy insides bare, and picking it apart such that one cannot unsee what one has painfully tried not to see about oneself for sometimes our entire lives. And then as the experience wears off, putting it all back together again, whereupon begins the process of integration, where one works through the lessons from the experience to integrate it into one's life going forwards. Now, that experience I've just described, if it sounds like it leaves one exposed and vulnerable for a period, oh yeah, it does. But so does surgery. And you wouldn't let your neighbor saw you in half. And that's exactly what those of us working in the movement are advocating for these medicines to be regulated for use by trained professionals in a safe and curated setting. You know, no one's going to be able to stop, for example, the psilocybin-containing mushrooms that Mother Earth gifts us every autumn from sprouting right here in this very soil. And as the body of evidence mounts globally, there's going to be increasing pressure for these substances to be used for healing. We want that to be done safely, not by your friendly neighborhood mind surgeon. So please support the move to make these therapies available such that they can be utilized in the manner that best harnesses their potential, because we need it.
Thank you very much, Dr. Prash. Simone Reed, we'll come to you next. Fearless, as we talked about before, really concentrates on post-traumatic stress. Can you just tell us a little bit about what that is and what Fearless does?
Hey, thanks, Ebony. Yeah, Fearless was established in 2010 as a charity, mainly to look at people with post-traumatic stress, but not just looking at military and frontline frontline services. We wanted to tap into, like, there's over 26 different groups that look into that post-traumatic stress. So you're looking at people from sexual assaults, you're looking at just breakdown of like post-traumatic stress. It's such a big topic in itself, and I'm sure we can have a webinar just on that. But I think the key element with Fearless was looking into our communities and looking at how we utilise what is already out there and bring them all together and start a conversation about what to do next. So 2009, Fearless actually had a conference up in the Sunshine Coast that brought community groups, that brought researchers, that brought doctors, that brought a whole heap of frontline services as well, and looked at what the share experience was, what worked, what didn't work, and it was promoted to start the conversation, and that's certainly what it has. So there's been an amazing ripple-on effect since that conference, and we've really looked at Fearless being that one-stop shop that everyone can come into or feed their information into, and then we can get it out into the wider communities and the wider people suffering from PTSD. Like, I'm sure when you walk out into your community, you've met someone that either has PTSD, has a family member, has spoken about it, heard about it. You don't have to go too far to tap into people that have experienced post-traumatic stress. And we need to get away from just thinking it's military frontline services. They are a big component. However, looking at people close to us, just traumas in general. So on saying that, I often think of Fearless as change, and that's what it was established for, to allow people to come together and create change in a way, whether it's through medicine, whether it's through natural therapies. We had a very good webinar in regards to using guide dogs and people to help through treatments. Yeah. So did you want me, Ebony, to talk a little bit about what my experience was, or?
That's up to you. If you'd like to share, feel free, but we've got heaps of questions here as well. But yeah, go ahead, Simone.
Well, I'll just touch on, I suppose, my experience. Yes, I've been in the military, but it was more from, my father was a Vietnam vet. I was programmed as a child to actually live in a world of post-traumatic stress. So very early on, and, Andrew, I really appreciate you being so open, because as a young girl, I experienced a lot of different traumas and didn't even realise I had, just because my father was very good at actually creating a world around, especially my brother and I, and even my mum, that the world was a very bad place, and we had to protect ourselves. And when we went out into that world, we had to be really careful with what we did, because we were hyper vigilant. And he taught us that through, we would walk around our house and we would check to make sure it was safe overnight time and things like that. So I think when we think about traumas, we think about big type issues, where with post-traumatic stress, we're tapping into traumas that might seem small or might seem little, but they have a really big impact and they shape one's life. And through that, that's when there's depressions and anxieties, and you don't actually know what's wrong, but you know that there's something is. And it took me a very long time, about 25, 26, when I realised that I had post-traumatic stress from what my father had taught me. To compound that, I suppose, I was sexually assaulted, so a trauma was layered on from that. I never got assistance or help for that. And it took me another 10 years after that to go, wow, that was a trauma, but it was never addressed. through military career, and also now having a child with special needs, it's a different layer of trauma on top of that. So I think today it's nice to talk about those lived experiences, but also what works for some people and may not work for others, but also to have that conversation about what's out there and where we can tap into it. You know, we hear exercise, we hear meditation, we hear self-care, we hear natural therapies, but what does that truly mean? And what do people do to feel better every day? And if that's tapping into organisations around us, then that's a real positive. So I'm happy to take any questions related to, how we can be encouraged and be vulnerable and look at fear and accept or go and seek help from that. But I suppose my leading remark was it takes courage to be vulnerable. And one of my big cues that I give to people around me is when you go and see your doctors or your GPs or the people that you want to get help for, make sure you're open and honest on the first visit, because research has shown that we're not talking about this until the second, third, fourth time. So I think vulnerability and allowing our fear and feeling those emotions is so important to get help early and to tap into those people who are willing to help around us.
Thanks so much for sharing that, Simone. And I imagine it is very difficult to be public about experiencing those traumas or experiences with depression and other things that people have shared here today. So thank you everyone for all of your contributions. We'll go to questions from the audience very shortly, but I am going to try one more time to play this video. So bear with me, everyone. Okay, here we go. Can people see that?
Yeah.
Did you know that over 45% of Australians will experience mental illness in their lifetime? That's nearly half of us.
I can't sleep. Everything feels flat and grey. I feel ashamed.
Mental ill health devastates lives and families and costs Australians around $60 billion a year. Research and treatment expenses continue to rise, yet rates of mental illness indicate that we're losing the battle. New approaches are urgently needed to address this immense suffering and cost. Psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy is currently being trialled worldwide and has demonstrated remarkable promise in treating depression, anxiety, addiction, and post-traumatic stress disorder, with new trials underway for treatment of dementia and anorexia. The treatment combines a short program of psychotherapy with just a few medicinal doses of psilocybin or MDMA. In the 1950s and 60s, psychedelic treatments had a major impact in psychiatry, and many considered it the next big thing in mental health treatment. But for political reasons, the Nixon administration criminalised the use of psychedelics and effectively stopped all research. That research has finally begun again. With proper clinical support, psychedelic treatments are safe and frequently lead to remission after only a short program, and even where current treatments have failed. Here at Mind Medicine Australia, we believe everyone should have access to the best treatments for mental illness. Subject to forthcoming clinical trial results, we will seek to establish best practice in regulated psychedelic-assisted treatment. Mind Medicine Australia is wholly focused on the clinical application of psychedelic medicines. We're preparing for change by developing therapist training, ethical guidelines, a centre of excellence in psychedelic medicine, educational material and events, and supporting clinical research. We're a small organisation doing big things, and we need your support. Please share this video and visit our website to support us and get involved.
I'm glad that finally worked. Thanks very much, everyone. And we will post a link to that video alongside the video of today's webinar so everyone can access that. I did just want to pick up on one element there and something that you talked about, Andrew Robb, about the politics here and why clinical trials and the pursuit of psychedelics as a clinical option really got cut off. I'm just wondering, as a former politician yourself, what are your reflections on the failures of politics to deal with an issue like this, and how do you think that's going to go in future?
Okay, this is well documented, what happened by people who were aides to President Nixon. There was the Vietnam War was on, which had a lot of difficulties in the United States. There were a lot of opposition within parts of the US population who were opposed to the war. President Nixon was finding difficulty in dealing with those that had another view. They did identify that a lot of the leaders of the anti-war movement were also people who were part of the 60s peace movement, and they also had participated with psychedelic drugs for recreational purposes. Now, also at the time, the black community in the United States was also opposed to the war, many of them, and they were taking heroin. So the Nixon administration, it decided to ban these drugs so they could then criminalise the activity of any of this recreational use of drugs, and as a consequence could address and attack and to jail in many cases some of the leaders of that peace movement. To deal with a political problem, they banned these drugs. The rest of the world saw what the US was doing, and politicians all around the world, in the Western world at least, adopted the same high-level banning and criminalisation of any use of these drugs. Through all of this, the medicinal use of psychedelics was not considered. The success that was being achieved at the time was not considered. The 40,000 papers in favour of research papers in favour of psychedelics during that period were not considered. And so really we've had a vacuum for 30, 50 years now, where psychedelics and the benefits of that have not been used. And as I said, I got a deep resentment about the loss of 50 years, because there's hundreds of thousands of people in Australia with experiences not dissimilar to mine, and that psychedelics could well have been very much to the fore. We are seeing, fortunately, in the clinical trials, because of the success that's being achieved, the administration in the United States has now fast-tracked the clinical trial program. There's similar things happening in the UK, in Israel. So we're starting to see a movement around the world, and Australia could and should and must be part of that.
Thanks, Andrew. So we are starting to see more of that health approach as opposed to criminalising all of this type of research, which sounds interesting and leads me on to one of our first questions here. This might be for you, Dr. Prash, or perhaps you, Tanya. It's from Alison Kakaios. No, I've pronounced that correctly. I'm sorry, Alison, incorrectly. Alison asks, are there any trials of the psychedelic medications in Australia that we can share with people on the webinar today? Any current trials in Australia?
Yeah, so Mind Medicine Australia is supporting the very first clinical trial in Australia, which is taking place at the moment at St Vincent's Hospital. It's using psilocybin assisted therapy to treat patients who are suffering from end-of-life anxiety and depression due to a terminal diagnosis. And these particular trials have taken place at New York University and Johns Hopkins University in the USA before, with outstanding outcomes. They're the 80% sort of remissions. And I think Dr. Prash, you mentioned recently that one of the studies had gone back and looked at some of these patients after 5 years and found not only that most of these patients were still alive, but that they were still in remission from their depression and anxiety through the diagnosis. So we're expecting some good outcomes from that trial.
Dr. Prash, did you want to add to that?
No, I mean, as far as the sort of the constraints of the question in terms of local studies, that's probably the scope of it at the moment. I think we have to understand that getting one of these trials off the ground is incredibly expensive. It requires multiple layers of regulatory approval, ethics approval. It requires a major institution to support you, and then begins the process of patient recruitment. It takes time, it takes money, and it takes a lot of support. And I think that's one of the barriers that trying to get these clinical trials off the ground in Australia keeps coming up against. And while there seems to be a lot of interest from the grassroots and from the ground, really the only way we're going to be able to scale these to produce the kind of evidence that can compete with current treatments out there is if there's support from the top down. Pure bottom-up support can only get us somewhere, but it's only top-down support that has the magnitude to be able to get these trials into the mainstream.
Thank you. And Simone, I wonder if there's anything that you'd like to add there about what's been effective in terms of post-traumatic stress.
Yeah, so with the post-traumatic stress and what we've found from the community in which we have been developing through Fearless is connection. So absolutely there is a place for medical intervention to be involved, but that along with finding your community, we call it. So you need to be able to tap into what works for you as an individual. So if you walk into a room and you feel, you know, that this is just not the right fit, you need to go and find where your right fit is, whether it's at a yoga studio, or whether it's a bushwalking group or a females group or anything like that. I think the promotion of sharing, talking and asking questions, and not just with your doctors and GPs, but people who have had that lived experience, and finding the one person that is prepared to help you. I do believe that people that go through trauma actually they have a very full cup already, and sometimes we try to assist too much. So I just want to put those measures out. If you can't assist someone, you need to find those people who can. So for me, that creating a community that works for you and think outside the norm. It might not be what everybody else is doing. So be open and honest within what you're feeling and those feelings and emotions.
Thank you. I've got two questions next that I feel are a little bit connected. One is from Steph Ray, who asks, do psychedelics and cannabis, she's thrown in there as well, pose other potential problems, such as an increased dementia risk or other risks, or is this still unknown? And connected to that, we've talked a little bit about some of the political barriers that have stopped more investigations into psychedelics, for example. But this question is for you, Tanya. What sort of feedback have you had from the AMA and others in the more in the wider medical community?
Mm-hmm. So, Prash, do you want Prash to answer the first part of the?
How about we go to you first on
Okay.
the response from the rest of the medical community?
Yeah. So, I mean, we've been talking with an enormous amount of doctors and medical practitioners, and we have a number of psychiatrists and GPs and others on our advisory panel and boards and so on supporting this. And suffice to say that what we're hearing from a lot of the psychiatrists and doctors is that they're desperately looking for treatments for their patients. They give examples that, you know, they might have 20 people come into the system to see them, and 2 years later, only one of those patients is healed. Many of the others have either dropped out of the system altogether or they're stuck in it, but not better. And they can't take on any more patients. So what you'll find is when you try and get into a psychiatrist, that their books are either full or they've got a wait list for 6 or 12 months. And if you're feeling suicidal or severely, you know, unwell, that's just not a solution. So I think the whole profession is certainly recognising the fact that we need to look at new treatments as soon as possible. And it's very important that people understand that these medicines are considered to be extremely safe and effective, but they wouldn't be in phase 3 trials with the FDA as a breakthrough therapy status if their safety hadn't been confirmed. And there's been absolutely no adverse events in over 120 trials worldwide. So the whole system are looking for innovation in treatment, and anyone who's really honest about this will acknowledge, as Andrew has so strongly reaffirmed and as Simone has spoken about, that, and Prash, that we need new treatment urgently right now. And actually I'm seeing some comments on the chat screen where people are saying this would be a really good post-COVID initiative for the government to start investing in new treatments coming out of this crisis, because we're not going to manage the increasing suicides and deaths of despair that are being caused by the pandemic unless we start using new treatment.
Thank you. Dr. Prash, did you have anything to add there about side effects or risk?
And safety, yes, absolutely. I think the first thing that I'd like to make very clear, and I couldn't stress this enough, is that there's a big difference between recreational use and therapeutic use. Someone taking acid at a music festival is considerably different from the kind of guided psychotherapy that we're talking about, in exactly the same way as there's a huge difference between injecting street heroin in a living room and there is to getting morphine post-operatively in a hospital, both in terms of the actual substance and the purity of the substance, and in terms of the guided, curated setting in which you receive it, even though they're both technically still opiates. There's a huge difference, and that's the principal difference that we're trying to be quite clear about as well. When you're talking about psychedelics used in a therapeutic setting, the evidence is clear that psychedelics have zero addiction potential. There's no overdose potential, and there is no statistically significant increase in mental health outcomes as a result of psychedelic use. There's been a 150,000 person respondent survey, I think it's Krebs et al. In 2016, looking into mental health outcomes from psychedelic use, and which revealed no significant increase in disorders. And I think that's crucial for everyone to understand, that the safety data does support this research. And while Australia has been perhaps behind in terms of moving forward with regulation, the FDA, as Tanya has mentioned, for something to get to breakthrough therapy standard or designation, it's not something that would happen lightly. And it's not something that would happen without safety considerations being taken into full account.
Thank you. We've got a quick question here. Again, Prash, this might be for you, and then I've got one that I think is more for Simone and Andrew. But Prudence Swan is asking, do psychedelics work for bipolar, for example?
So there hasn't really been any research into the use in bipolar. And I think most psychiatrists would urge caution in that regard. There is in a segment of the, when it comes to mental health illnesses, they tend to be divided broadly into psychotic spectrum disorders and the more neurotic spectrum disorders, which is where things like anxiety, depression fall into. Predominantly, psychedelics have been studied for the use in neurotic spectrum disorders. With psychotic spectrum disorders, there's definitely a greater risk. And similarly to the way research has been conducted with medical cannabis, it is generally been avoided in psychotic spectrum disorders. And I think at least for quite a while, that will continue to be the way we go. We have to understand that research and getting therapies like this into mainstream therapy has to be a graduated approach. We're not going to go from 0 to 100 in a couple of months. It has to be a graduated approach, and working with conditions that pose demonstrable less risk to patients has got to be the way we start with. And investigating things like bipolar, for example, would be most distinctly much further down the track, and we would definitely urge caution with that at this point in time.
Thank you. The next question I think is probably more one for you, Simone and Andrew. It's from Steph Ray, who asks, do you think the fact that Australia is particularly individualistic and that we have, sorry, I'm going to combine another question here from Chris Kelly. a real focus on really promoting our own lives as good and great and awesome and fabulous on social media, and there's not really a space to talk about negative feelings, and there still is a little bit of a stigma associated with mental health. Is part of that stigma, and also that need to put on kind of a front that everything is good, really preventing people from talking about their problems and accessing help. I might come to you first, Andrew.
Thanks, Ebony. Could I just backtrack 1 second
Sure.
to talk about that briefly about the last issue that Prash was talking about. My condition was diagnosed as diurnal variation, because I'd go to sleep taking on the world, wake up depressed. Every day I went from being deeply depressed to being an A-type personality each day. And so, and the mood issues dealt with around universities and a lot of the profession tend to also have bipolar research done in the same sort of area. So I'm no expert at all, but it does seem to me that that's where the professionals are looking at those sorts of connections. Now, onto the stigma. I mean, I travel and still do travel when we haven't got a pandemic in the region, and the sort of stigma that existed years when I was a kid, you know, people would say, oh, you know, Aunt Mary, she's got nerves. And it was a cute way of saying she's deeply depressed. And they keep compartmentalising conditions to try and explain depression in a different way, because it was seen as a weakness of character. If you had depression, you couldn't man up and deal with the problems of the day because you had this mental condition. So I'm finding that Australia is becoming fortunately, far more accepting of depression and the existence of it, and the fact that it's another illness. It's not necessarily a character issue. It's a medical illness that affects people in all sorts of different ways. So I've seen other countries in China and India and Indonesia and Malaysia and Vietnam that the stigma is like it was 40 years ago in Australia. So it's not just common to Australia. We are actually trying to deal with it, and things like the AFL Football League and NRL, a lot of things they're doing to try and show that some of their players are affected by this as an acceptance of it. They give them time off, help them get treatment. So you're right, the therapy, or the questioner is right. The stigma is a big issue. It's still an issue out there, I think, but it's not like it was when I was a kid.
Thank you. Simone, there's a question here about people really feeling like they're alone and it's all up to them to manage their own mental health. And does that idea of being alone really increase the amount of mental health issues that we're dealing with? I know Fearless is kind of trying to make those connections. Perhaps you can comment on that.
Yeah, absolutely. And just on Andrew's point with the stigma, yes, Australia is doing very well, but we've still got a very long way to go. And, you know, I think about new mums, especially throughout this, pandemic, that they go to the hospital, have their babies, come home, and there's only online community groups, like new mums that they're going through their own traumas. That leads to that next question is, they often feel alone, and I've just tapped into a self-care group or a support group of new mums that have had babies in the last 12 to 15 weeks, and they're struggling because there's no, mothers groups like we would see if you're a mum, or, like what, 12 months ago than what we were seeing. So this alone and what is very real, and people I think feel more alone than what we imagine. And I'm thinking year 12 students going through their HSC, like this alone type feeling. But for me, I think it goes back to finding your community. You find the people that make you happy. You find the people that you can connect to get you out of the house, to come and pick you up when you need, that you can call out and be real. So I've just written down, as you asked that question, it's just about being real and having that voice and that self-positive talk. And that, along with medications or natural therapies or whatever you choose, can be a really good recipe to feel well and get better, especially while all this research is going on and we're moving in the right direction. But I don't feel that we're there yet. So for Fearless especially, it's looking at what communities you can really tap into to suit you as that individual.
Thank you. The last question that we've got here is from Jeanette O'Dell-Tays. She says, considering the battle that had to be undergone to get approval for medical marijuana and for assisted dying, how difficult do you think it's going to be to get unconventional therapies made available for treatment of mental health conditions in Australia? Tanya, I might come to you first and then perhaps we'll finish with you, Andrew Robb. Tanya, to you first.
Well, so the good news is that we are starting to see the first approvals in Australia, and this is historic for psychiatrists who are applying to the TGA on a case-by-case basis for their treatment-resistant patients with psilocybin and MDMA. So we've seen probably about 10 approvals come through already. So that's a federal approval. Now we're just trying to deal with all the different state regulations in our wonderful federated system. But that's a really good start. The SASB scheme is what has been used to make medicinal cannabis available so widely already. And the approvals are coming through very quickly. So the doctors are applying, and within 48 hours, they're getting approvals to actually conduct these treatments. We also today, and this is absolutely historic, have opened the TGA has opened the consultation period for the rescheduling of psilocybin and MDMA. So we've put in rescheduling applications. Should those applications be approved, we'll be the first Western nation in the world where these medicines aren't already legal to actually reclassify these medicines in 50 years. So we encourage every single person out there with lived experience, or if your doctor's looking for treatments for your patients, or Simone and people from Fearless, to make sure that you do put in submissions to this process, because it's really important that the regulator hears from you and understands how important it is for these medicines to be available, not just for research, but for patients, you know, as soon as possible.
Thank you. And Andrew, we'll come to you finally. Looking forward into the future, do you really feel like politics will shift and can cope with dealing with these kinds of issues with a health approach as opposed to the criminal justice approach that we've taken in the past that's kind of prevented the clinical side of things from happening?
I must say I am cautiously very confident because of the results. In the end, I think the significant and remarkable outcomes that we're observing in places around the world in the clinical trials, it's irrefutable evidence that there's a significant place for psychedelic assisted therapies in Australia. And in the end, you know, most politicians will be on all sides of politics, will be influenced by the outcomes, but invariably they follow on these issues, they don't lead. And that's why groups like Mind Medicine and many other groups, Fearless, all of these, have got to, if they can very, you know, significantly turn on the heat, really, of politicians. Politicians respond to the contact they have, the emails that come into them, all of those sorts of pressures to make judgments about how confidently they can go out and perhaps explore this area. We're getting a very good response from Greg Hunt, for instance, and I think the clinical trials, though, are critical to this, but would it be too long to wait for the Australian clinical trials? They're being done writ large in the United States and in the UK and Israel. We need to capture that experience and go through the steps of convincing the politicians. But it will come from groups, other groups within our community, putting pressure on politicians to see any real meaningful and fast change in the current situation.
Thank you very much. We'll have to wrap it up there. Thank you to all of our guests today, Andrew Robb, Simone Reed, Tanya de Jong and Dr. Prash. And thank you everyone for all your great questions. I'm sorry, as usual, we can't get to all of them. We do have more exciting webinars coming up in the next few weeks. You can join us next Wednesday, the 2nd of September, with former President of Timor-Leste, Jose Ramos Horta, for a webinar on East Timor and oil, along with Bernard Collaery. And on Wednesday, the 9th of September, we'll be talking to Craig Rucastle about his recent documentary series for the ABC, The Fight for Planet A. That'll be A Plan for Planet A with Craig Rucastle. That's on Wednesday, the 9th of September at 11 a.m. And make sure that you're subscribed to our podcast, Follow the Money. You can find that on iTunes or wherever you normally listen to podcasts. And in this week's episode, we talk about the role of neoliberalism in spreading coronavirus. And please remember to stay 1.5 meters away, keep washing your hands, wear a mask when you go out, and stay safe, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today, and hopefully we'll see you next week. Thanks again to all of our guests. Goodbye.